Because this lesson we have the well-being period at the start, I'm just going to make a little bit of a recording so those of you at home can get the teaching experience for this lesson without having to have a live meet. So hopefully you can see the slide. It shows the life cycle of a flowering plant. Because it's a cycle, you can start at any point. You can start with seeds germinating, growing into a mature plant. You can go to petals and how this is affected either by wind or by insects. You can look at fertilized plants, and then you can look at fruit formation and seed formation. So the first thing to talk about is pollen. So pollen is the grain of the flower, which is the male gamete. When you look at a flower in the middle, you'll often see these little areas here. This head has a fine powder on top of it. This powder is the pollen. Around the outside of this central structure, which quite often looks like a big kind of pointy wheel. As the weather gets warmer, flowers will open, and you'll be able to see this inside the flower. Pollen can be transferred from one flower to another by various means. As I said, this is the male gamete of this flower. We want to get the male gamete of this flower to the female part of the next flower, which is the central part here. So what we do is we've got two different methods. We've got insect pollination. So insect pollination involves an insect traveling to a flower, going towards what's called the nectary, which is an area around the outside of this that's full of a nice sweet nectar. When the insect comes in, going to the nectary, it gets covered in the pollen from around the outside here. It then goes to another flower and again goes in towards the nectary. This time it will drop the male gamete from the previous flower onto the female part, which is the central bit here. There's also wind pollination. So in insect pollinated plants, you tend to have the pollen enclosed within the flower, and in wind pollinated, you tend to have big structures outside the flower of the plant which are able to catch the wind. In a similar way to insect pollination, the pollen is transferred, this time via the wind, and it randomly lands on other plants. Some of these plants will be plants of the same species, and if the pollen can get to the central part of those plants, it will pollinate them. These are the parts of a flower. So on the outside we have the petal. It's a brightly coloured area, quite often heavily scented. This attracts insects to this flower. So if you find a very brightly coloured, very nice smelling plant, it's probably an insect pollinated plant. The insect will come in, attracted by the petals and the scent, and it will move in and try and find the nectary, which is around here, either side of what's labelled the style. When the insect comes in, it rubs against the anther, which is this. I always think of it as the antler, like out on the outside of the plant here. This is where the pollen is made, developed, and also stored. When the insect goes in, it rubs against the anther, it gets covered in pollen. The anther are kept up here on long strands called filaments. These allow the anthers to float above the top of the style. So the outside, in a little kind of circle around the middle of the plant, is the male part. So we have the anther with the filament. Together we call those the stamen. In the center of the plant, we have the female section, which as a unit is called the style. So again, the petals attract insects to visit the flower. The colours that we see are the flower petals, quite different to those seen by insects. So they have different eyes and they will observe these flowers in a very different way. This is how we see them, and this is how the insects. The stigma receives the pollen from visiting insects, so it is one of the female parts of the flower. The others are the style and the ovary. So the style is this area here. It's what we could see from above when we looked at the previous pictures. It is leading down towards the ovary, which is nestled at the very bottom of the flower here. It's another of the female parts of the flower. The ovary is the third part. It's located at the very base of the flower. So you have to go all the way in past the style and the stigma to get to the ovary. This is where the female gametes, the egg, are stored. Together, the three female parts can be called the pistil or the carpel. and the female parts are where the flowers will be making their seeds. This is where the pollen has to travel down to. It'll land onto this part here, and it'll make a pollen tube to get down to the eggs. I've talked about the filament. It's what the anther is balanced on top of. It's one of the male parts of the flower. Together with the anther, this filament is called the stamen. So the anther, one of the male parts of the flower, the size and shape of the anther will attract the correct insects. So some insects will see that and think, oh, I don't know what to do with that. And some will think, oh my God, definitely going for that. So different insects will pollinate different flowers. This is important because if you can make sure that only one type of insect will come to you, and that maybe, if you say, I don't know, the Hessian bumblebee, what is the only type of insect who will try and reach your nectary, and it only goes to flowers of your species, that means you can almost guarantee that you'll be visited by an insect that then goes to a flower of the same species. You don't really want an insect going to every different type of plant, because it'll end up depositing your pollen on a plant that really you can't fertilize, so it's not the same species as you. So your turn, try and label this in your booklet. Pollination, so this is what we're aiming at really. During pollination, the pollen grain will be transferred from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another, either by wind or by insect. Pollen grain lands on the this area here, on the style, and a pollen tube will then grow down like this, and then it will reach the ovary where there's an ovule. So this is the stages. Pollen grain from the same or different flower lands on the stigma. Plants can often self-pollinate, so the anther will drop pollen down and it will land on the stigma and a pollen tube will form. Some plants have various very cunning genetic ways of stopping that. The pollen grain stimulates the growth of the pollen tube. The nucleus of the pollen grain travels down until it reaches the ovary, where it fertilizes the egg cell, the ovule, to make a zygote. After this has happened, the flowers will wither away. If we've had fertilization, we quite often have a fruit forming on top of this. So if you see a strawberry, you'll quite often see withered flowers around the outside of each strawberry. That's how this happens. So it's from the ovule that we develop the seeds. The outer wall of the ovule will harden and thicken to form the seed coat. The ovary develops into the fruit. So if you think about it, if lots and lots of ovules are inside this ovary, as a whole, the rest of the plant the flower will wither, and the ovary as a whole will form the fruit. Inside it, there can be multiple different seeds. So if you think of the ovary of the tomato plant being the tomato, inside that, we can see lots and lots of seeds. So seed dispersal. So now we have lots of seeds. What good is that really? So the seeds need to get from the parent plant to a new location. This can happen either by being blown in the wind. So sometimes these are the seeds of this dandelion, and the wind will, or people kicking them, will disperse these over the wind, and they'll land, go into the soil, and they will grow their shoots and roots off that. You can be eaten by animals. So if you're a tasty tomato, you're eaten, and then your seeds will pass out through the feces of an animal, and in that lovely rich manure, the seeds can germinate and grow. Or you can get these burrs. Quite often dogs in heavy grass will get covered in these burrs, and then when they're deposited miles and miles away, again, the seed will form into a plant. So reduce competition. It's good to try and spread out as far as possible from the parental plant. You don't want all of your 1,000 progeny landing right underneath you and competing for things like warmth, for soil, for space, for light, for water, for nutrients. So you want your progeny to go as far away from you as possible so that they don't compete with you for space. Hopefully that made sense. If you've got any questions, please do ask.